You may not have known this, but many of the scholars believe that Christ's crucifixion was literally hell on earth. Christ's sacrifice was different from all others, all martyrs, all those in whom have given their lives for others throughout history. Christ was completely different. It was far more agonizing. And the second reason why this is very significant is because it shows us certain aspects of hell, I fully believe. Number one, notice how it went dark upon the earth the final 3 hours that he was upon the cross. Number two, he could not move. And I believe that that's an often overlooked aspect of one of the sufferings of hell. He was nailed, he couldn't move, and it says in hell you've lost your strength. Number three, he was in constant pain from head to feet. He had the crown of thorns upon him. He was pierced in every way. Number four, he was very thirsty. Recall what Jesus said of the rich man in hell. One of his foremost complaints was that of thirst. And Jesus was very thirsty upon the cross. Number five, he could barely breathe. That's one of the most agonizing parts of the cross. It's very difficult to get any breath, and in hell you can only imagine how difficult that it is to breathe. So it's very dark. That's frightening in and of itself. You cannot move, so it's not like you can defend yourself or try to run away in hell. Constant pain all over you. Thirsty. You must struggle to just breathe. Number six, the suffering lingered. It wasn't just for a moment, but it just kept on and on and on. Number seven, he was completely exposed. There is no clothing, no armor, no protection in hell. Completely exposed. Number eight, he was surrounded by evil beings. In Psalm 22, it speaks of the bulls of Bashan surround me, and that's these really strong evil beings that surrounded him, both in the spiritual realm as well as all around him, the Romans and the Jewish people that hated him and so forth. Number nine, he was bearing sins, the sins of all in whom believe on him. He was having to bear them, and I believe that was probably the most agonizing part for Christ, is that he was bearing these sins, because it leads us into number 10. He felt forsaken by God. If you'll notice, it's at the point when the darkness overcomes him that he cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And that's probably why he was so tormented in the Garden of Gethsemane beforehand, because he had never had any type of impurity or sin upon him. And suddenly he knew that God was going to have to judge him as he would the most evil of sinners. 1 Peter 2:24 tells us, "Who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sin, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed." So in essence, Christ suffered hell on earth so we wouldn't suffer hell in the afterlife. Now, before I leave off on this video, I would also like to point out some other very interesting facts. Here are some similarities that connect the fall in the garden with that of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross some 4,000 years later. And I believe that it was set up like this so that Jesus would almost have to relive certain aspects of what happened back then in the garden in order to redeem us. First of all, a garden was involved in both cases, the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. A tree was involved in both cases, that of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that of the tree in which was the cross that Christ was crucified upon. Notice how Adam and Eve ate the fruit of Satan's deception in disobedience, whereas Jesus Christ drank the cup of God's wrath in obedience. Notice how Adam and Eve became naked and ashamed. Jesus Christ was also exposed upon the cross in a humiliating fashion, yet Hebrews 12:2 tells us how he despised the shame, meaning that he overlooked the shame. He disregarded it. He knew that he had to go through with this. Note also how the bride of Adam, Eve, was taken from his side. Well, the bride of Christ issued from his side. To quote Adrian Rogers, just as the woman was taken out of the wounded side of man, so was the church taken out of the wounded side of Christ, as we are all bought with his blood. Remember how Adam sinned and brought death. Well, Jesus never sinned, yet took ours upon himself and brought life. And though we see similarities between our first parents and our Creator in these two events, We can also point out the stark contrast in that Adam and Eve walked in paradise on earth. Jesus, however, endured hell on earth in order to redeem us and bring us to the paradise in heaven, the greater one. Now, I have other videos showing these similarities between that of Jesus and Joseph, Jesus and Isaac. You all can check those out. And just for an example of what's on those, right here is the final slide that I'll show. On Mount Moriah, the very place in which Christ was crucified 2,000 years later, on Mount Moriah, the ram was caught in thorns. The substitutionary sacrifice in the place of Isaac, the ram, in which is just an adult lamb, its horns were caught in thorns. 2,000 years later, Christ wore a crown of thorns. So we see the foreshadowing going on here. And once again, there are tons of other slides just like that on those other videos.